Elijah Harper's world was one of quiet, the kind of quiet that filled every inch of his life, both comforting and confining. Born deaf, the sounds that filled others' lives were mysteries to him, faint impressions only when they carried through the floor or walls, vague hints of a world he couldn't fully grasp. At 10 years old, he was used to being a silent observer in a noisy world, with questions and dreams swirling within him that he couldn't quite share. Each morning at St. Mary's School for Inclusive Learning, he would slip through the hallways like a shadow. The vibrant murals and the motivational posters that covered the walls promising unity, acceptance, and respect felt like cruel reminders of a world that didn't include him. As he watched classmates laughing and chatting in groups, their voices loud and lively, he felt the sting of exclusion, a feeling that never quite dulled, no matter how familiar it became. Elijah often wondered if anyone noticed him at all. To the teachers, he was another face, a student to manage but rarely to engage. His primary teacher, Miss Archer, would cast the occasional glance in his direction, but her expressions were fleeting, indifferent, as if acknowledging him was a chore. For her, his silence was an obstacle, something inconvenient and challenging, and she chose to sidestep it whenever possible. She'd explain the day's lesson facing away from him or scribble instructions on the board without checking if he could see. Each oversight chipped away at his hope, his belief that he might belong here. The few friends he had at his previous school had moved away, leaving him to navigate St. Mary's alone. And here, he was the easy target, the boy who wouldn't tell, who couldn't protest. The cruel attention he received often came from Tyler McKinney, a tall, arrogant boy with a smug look that Elijah had come to fear. Tyler would mock his hearing aids, sneer at his attempts to sign, and laugh with his friends as they mimicked his gestures and exaggerated motions. Each encounter left Elijah feeling smaller, more invisible. At home, he kept his pain hidden. His mother, Grace, worked tirelessly, often late into the evening, and he didn't want to add to her burdens. She was his safe haven, his source of comfort, and every night she'd sit beside him, telling him stories with her hands and her heart. She'd signed tales of heroes who faced incredible odds, who stood against the darkness and triumphed. Those moments felt like magic, like he was part of something greater, something that saw beyond his silence. But each morning, the reality of school came crashing back, and with it, the isolation. St. Mary's was supposed to be a haven for children like him, a place that celebrated diversity and embraced differences. But as Elijah walked its halls, he felt more like a ghost than a student, his dreams echoing silently within him, unheard and unseen. On the first day of the new school year, his mother dropped him off, her usual warm smile tempered by a hint of worry she tried to hide. Elijah noticed how her eyes lingered on him as he hesitated by the car door. She wanted him to be happy here, to thrive. He wanted that too. With a small, brave nod, he forced a smile and waved, watching as she drove away, her figure fading into the distance. Inside, the hallways were filled with students laughing, voices bouncing off the walls, filling the space with a noise that Elijah could feel, even if he couldn't hear. He walked past groups of children huddled by lockers, their faces bright with stories of summer adventures, their words lost to him but their joy evident. The energy was palpable, vibrating through the floor, reminding him of everything he couldn't access. He walked into the classroom, his gaze immediately settling on Miss Archer. She acknowledged him with a brief nod before returning to her notes, her attention drifting over him like he was part of the furniture. Elijah took his seat in the back, where he could watch without being seen. As the class began, he focused on her lips, trying to catch fragments of her words, his hands clutching the edge of his desk, his eyes straining. When he missed instructions, she'd frown, a look of mild annoyance passing over her face, as if he had somehow chosen not to hear her. Elijah's cheeks would burn, the shame twisting inside him, making him wish he could disappear. He wanted so desperately to fit in, to be just like the others, to experience the world the way they did. At recess, he drifted to the edge of the playground, near the tall oak trees that provided a pocket of shade and solitude. He watched as groups of kids played tag, their laughter ringing out, a sound he could only imagine. From his spot, He could see Tyler and his friends, their faces twisted with mocking laughter as they whispered to one another, occasionally casting sidelong glances in his direction. Elijah felt his chest tighten, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack as if it were a lifeline. He tried to focus on the feel of the wind rustling through the leaves, the warmth of the sun on his face. But the isolation gnawed at him, a relentless ache he couldn't escape. This was supposed to be a place of acceptance, a place where he'd find friends, where he'd feel understood. Instead, he felt like he was watching life through a glass wall, close enough to see but forever locked out. As the first bell rang, signaling the end of recess, Elijah took a deep breath, his heart heavy yet resilient. He reminded himself of his mother's stories, of the heroes who faced the impossible. Maybe, somehow, he could be one of them too. His journey was different, his challenges unique, but perhaps within his silence, there was a strength yet to be discovered, a power no one else could see. And with that small glimmer of hope, Elijah stepped back into the noise, ready to face another day. Days passed in this silent solitude, until one afternoon, as he sat in the library with a worn book he'd read countless times before, he felt a change in the air. Looking up, he saw Tyler McKinney. Tyler's presence was unmistakable. He was tall for his age, with an air of entitlement that came from a life of comfort and privilege. Flanked by two of his friends, he towered over Elijah, who instinctively shrank back, his heart beating faster. Tyler's gaze was sharp, like a predator sizing up his prey. Tyler mouthed words, exaggerating each one, knowing Elijah wouldn't understand. Elijah could feel his cheeks heating up, his eyes stinging, but he refused to show fear. Tyler leaned closer, gesturing as if he was signing in a mocking manner, his friends laughing alongside him. "Can you hear me, Elijah?" he mouthed slowly, his lips curling into a sneer. Elijah knew that voice from previous encounters. He didn't need to hear the exact words to feel the venom behind them. Tyler was relentless, always finding ways to make him feel small, to remind him of how different he was from everyone else. With a quick, cruel motion, Tyler reached out and snatched Elijah's hearing aid, yanking it from his ear. Elijah gasped, instinctively reaching to grab it back, but Tyler held it just out of his reach, waving it like a trophy. For Elijah, the world became a void, quiet, suffocating, and terrifyingly isolating. The loss of his hearing aid, as outdated and clunky as it was, felt like being locked out of the world. Without it, he could sense even less of what was happening around him. He could no longer hear the faint hum of students' voices in the background, or the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. All he could feel was his own rapid heartbeat, pounding in his chest like a drum. Elijah's eyes pleaded silently, and he reached out, hoping Tyler would return his hearing aid. But instead, Tyler's laughter grew, and he tossed it to one of his friends, who held it up mockingly before pretending to fumble and nearly drop it. Elijah's heart dropped each time the device left one boy's hand, flying to the next. His breathing became shallow, each second that passed feeling like an eternity. Just as Elijah thought he couldn't bear it any longer, he saw a figure passing by the library's glass doors. It was Mr. Langley, the physical education teacher, who glanced briefly in their direction. Elijah's eyes lit up with hope, silently begging for intervention. He prayed that Mr. Langley would step in, stop the torment, and restore some order to the world that felt increasingly hostile. But Mr. Langley merely shrugged, his gaze drifting away as he walked past without a second glance. In that moment, Elijah felt his last thread of hope snap. He was truly alone. With a final mocking laugh, Tyler threw the hearing aid onto the floor, letting it skid across the cold tiles. Elijah scrambled to pick it up, his fingers trembling as he dusted it off, hoping it hadn't been damaged in the process. As he carefully reinserted it, he felt a mixture of anger, humiliation, and helplessness. A silent storm brewing within him. When the last bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Elijah didn't linger. He walked out of the school building as quickly as he could, his shoulders tense, his heart heavy. The world felt colder than ever, and he could still feel the weight of Tyler's mockery hanging over him like a shadow. That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he turned the events over in his mind. For the first time, his usually composed face showed signs of distress. His mother, Grace, came into his room, sensing something was wrong. She gently sat beside him, brushing his hair back, her eyes filled with concern. "Elijah, honey, is something going on at school?" she asked, her voice soft, laced with worry. Elijah met her gaze, his eyes watering slightly, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her. He knew she worried about him enough already, working 2 jobs to make sure he had everything he needed. He didn't want to add to her burden, even if he felt the weight of his own growing heavier each day. Instead, he shook his head slightly, forcing a small, brave smile. Grace studied his face for a long moment, not entirely convinced but respecting his silence. She gently squeezed his hand, whispering words of comfort, hoping her presence was enough to ease whatever pain he was holding inside. As Grace left the room, Elijah lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling trapped in a world where his cries for help remained unheard. And as he drifted to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring more of the same. A silent struggle in a world that refused to see him. The days that followed the library incident were an agonizing blur for Elijah. He felt the weight of every step he took through the school's hallways, each turn holding the potential for yet another encounter with Tyler and his friends. Though he tried to keep his head down, avoiding their attention, it was as if his silence, his vulnerability, had marked him as a target for their relentless cruelty. And in a place meant to foster acceptance, Elijah felt like an outsider in every possible way. One chilly morning, Elijah arrived early, hoping to have a few moments of peace in his classroom before the chaos of the day unfolded. He pulled out a notebook, pressing his pencil to the page and allowing his thoughts to spill out in silent whispers. He drew shapes, doodles of things he imagined. A safe space, a friend, a world where he could express himself without fear. But as the classroom began to fill, he sensed the familiar presence of Tyler and his friends. They noticed him immediately, exchanging quick glances, a shared smirk spreading across their faces. Elijah's stomach tightened, but he kept his gaze down, pretending to focus on his drawing. He hoped, for once, they'd lose interest and leave him alone. Instead, Tyler sauntered over, snatching the notebook from Elijah's desk. He flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing in mock interest at Elijah's sketches and notes. Elijah reached out, desperate to retrieve his notebook, but Tyler held it out of reach, taunting him with each turn of the page. "These are interesting," Tyler mouthed slowly, his friend snickering. "What's this supposed to be?" He pointed at one of Elijah's drawings of a boy and a girl holding hands, a small, private hope Elijah had sketched, imagining a friend he might find one day. Elijah felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He could sense the mocking in Tyler's gaze, the cruelty in his expression. Elijah's fists clenched and he wanted to grab the notebook back, but he hesitated. He had learned from past experiences that retaliation only fueled their amusement. His silence was his armor, a fragile barrier against the pain they seemed so determined to inflict. Tyler's friends chimed in, making exaggerated gestures, mimicking Elijah's way of moving and the stillness in his expressions. They mocked his isolation, as if his silence somehow made him less human, a mere object for their entertainment. Suddenly, one of the teachers, Mrs. Hargrove, entered the room. The boys immediately straightened, adopting innocent expressions as if nothing had happened. Elijah saw the quick shift, a well-practiced routine they had perfected over time. Mrs. Hargrove's gaze passed over them briefly before settling on Elijah, who stood frozen, the notebook clutched in Tyler's hand. For a moment, her eyes lingered on Elijah's reddened face, his tense posture. But then, just as quickly, she looked away, shuffling her papers with a slight frown, as if their interaction was simply a minor disturbance to her morning routine. "Take your seats, everyone," she instructed, not sparing Elijah another glance. Elijah sank into his chair, his body slumping, as Tyler dropped the notebook onto his desk with a smug grin. He tried to refocus, to pretend none of it mattered, but his hands shook as he gripped his pencil. Mrs. Hargrove's indifference was more painful than any words Tyler could have thrown at him. She was an adult, a figure of authority, someone who should have offered protection, or at least acknowledgement. But her silence echoed louder than anything else, a reminder that he was truly alone in his fight. As the weeks passed, the harassment grew worse. Tyler's games became increasingly cruel, his friends joining in without hesitation. Elijah became adept at hiding his pain, burying it beneath a mask of calm. He would wait until the end of each school day, retreating to a secluded corner of the playground to release his frustrations through silent tears. No one ever noticed him there, hidden among the tall trees that bordered the playground, his small figure blending into the shadows. At home, Elijah became quieter, more withdrawn. Grace noticed the change, but each time she asked him about school, he'd shake his head, offering her a faint smile. He couldn't bring himself to tell her about the bullying. He didn't want her to see him as weak, didn't want her to feel that he couldn't handle himself. More than anything, he feared making her worry, feared adding another burden to her already heavy load. One evening, as Elijah lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. He imagined a life where he was no longer trapped by silence, where his words could reach others, where someone, anyone, would understand him. He clung to that image, letting it lull him into a restless sleep. But the following day, the reality of his isolation crashed down harder than ever. It was during recess when Tyler approached him again. This time, they were outside, near the back of the school where the teachers rarely monitored. Tyler leaned in, his face inches from Elijah's, and mouthed words that Elijah couldn't fully understand, but whose intent was clear. Tyler's hand shot out, knocking Elijah's hearing aid to the ground. Elijah's heart sank as he watched the device hit the dirt, a small crack forming on its surface. His chest tightened, and he quickly bent down to retrieve it, wiping away the dust with trembling fingers. The crack was small, but he knew his mother wouldn't be able to afford a new one, and the thought filled him with a sense of dread and helplessness. As Elijah stood, Tyler smirked, patting him on the shoulder with a mock sympathy that made Elijah's skin crawl. The boys walked away, laughing, leaving Elijah alone once more, clutching the broken hearing aid. He took a deep breath, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. In that moment, he felt the weight of every silent scream, every unvoiced plea for help. The world continued around him, unaware of the small, broken boy standing in its shadow. But as he turned to walk back to class, something within him shifted. He didn't know what it was. Perhaps it was a spark of defiance, a small flicker of strength. But he knew one thing. He couldn't endure this alone forever. He vowed that somehow he would find a way to make himself heard. And whether the world was ready to listen or not, Elijah Harper would no longer be invisible. Elijah felt the days melting into each other, each one a mirror of the last, steeped in silent pain and enduring isolation. His usual refuge, the worn-out corner of the playground, hidden by a line of old oaks, no longer felt like enough. He often sat there, gazing at the playground filled with laughter and voices he couldn't fully hear. Each giggle, each shout reminded him of the world he could see but never quite reach. One afternoon, after an exhausting day of dodging Tyler and his friends, Elijah's solitude was interrupted by a newcomer to the playground, a girl named Amelia. She was quiet herself, with an air of curiosity that immediately put Elijah on edge. She noticed him sitting there and, rather than walking away, chose to sit nearby, close enough to share the shade of the trees, but giving him space. For several minutes, they sat in silence, and Elijah felt the weight of her presence. It was different from the others. There was no mockery, no judgment, only quiet curiosity. After a few moments, she smiled and started signing, her hands moving in simple, welcoming gestures. Elijah blinked in surprise. Amelia knew how to sign. He hesitated, glancing down as if unsure he could trust the connection she offered, but then he tentatively signed back. "Hello?" Amelia's eyes lit up and they exchanged a few more words, awkward and hesitant at first but slowly growing more natural. She told him she had a cousin who was deaf, which was why she had learned some basic sign language. Elijah found himself smiling for the first time in weeks, his hands moving faster as they communicated. Their friendship blossomed over the days that followed, and Elijah's heart lifted in ways he hadn't thought possible. Amelia was kind, gentle, and most importantly, she treated him with respect. With her, he felt seen, heard, even though no words were spoken. The weight he'd carried alone felt lighter with her presence, and he began to believe that he could endure school if he had at least one friend by his side. But Tyler noticed the change. His sharp, piercing gaze zeroed in on the subtle shifts in Elijah's demeanor, his newfound strength. To Tyler, it was a challenge, a disruption of the order he had crafted, a world where Elijah was alone, vulnerable, and an easy target. One afternoon, as Elijah was preparing to leave school, Tyler cornered him near the exit. Amelia had already left for the day, leaving Elijah alone. Tyler's friends surrounded them, forming a tight circle that made Elijah feel trapped. He clutched his backpack straps, his breathing shallow as he looked around, hoping for a teacher or any adult to intervene. But the hallway was empty, and Tyler's eyes glinted with a dangerous determination. "You think you're special now?" Tyler mouthed slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, dripping with malice. "You think one friend will change anything?" Elijah's chest tightened, but he stood his ground, clenching his fists. Tyler's hand shot out, shoving him against the wall, his voice hissing words that Elijah couldn't fully understand, but he knew enough to understand the threat. Tyler's words were harsh, words Elijah wished he didn't have to see or interpret through Tyler's expression. He could feel the hatred, the bitterness that ran deeper than just schoolyard cruelty. It was a raw, unfiltered disdain that went beyond him, laced with venom that cut into him in ways he struggled to comprehend. In that moment, Elijah realized the conflict went beyond simple bullying. Tyler was embodying something more, a need for control, a desire to make Elijah feel small, insignificant. The cruelty wasn't only about mocking Elijah's deafness or isolating him socially. It was rooted in a deeper, more sinister desire to break Elijah's spirit, to strip away the last shreds of his self-worth. As Elijah looked into Tyler's eyes, he saw the truth. Tyler saw him as lesser, as someone undeserving of respect, friendship, or dignity. And that realization hurt more than any physical shove or insult. It was a wound that cut deep, leaving Elijah feeling fractured, his self-worth crumbling under the weight of Tyler's hatred. After the incident, Elijah returned home in silence, his body moving through the motions of daily life, while his mind churned with confusion and pain. That night, he sat on his bed, clutching his pillow as tears streamed down his face. His mother knocked on the door gently, her voice soft and comforting as she entered. She sat beside him, sensing his distress, but Elijah couldn't bring himself to explain the torment he was enduring. Instead, he signed a few words, his hands trembling. "Why do they hate me?" Grace's heart broke as she watched her son, his face etched with pain she couldn't fully understand, but desperately wished to alleviate. She took his hands in hers, steadying them, grounding him. "Elijah," she began, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and strength. "Sometimes people hurt others because they're afraid. They see something they don't understand, and it scares them. But I didn't do anything wrong." Elijah signed, his movements growing sharper, desperate. Grace pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "No, honey, you didn't. This isn't your fault. People's cruelty often has nothing to do with us and everything to do with their own fears, their own flaws." Elijah felt a small measure of comfort in his mother's words, but the hurt lingered. The knowledge that Tyler's hatred was about something more than childish teasing weighed heavily on him. He knew he couldn't change Tyler's heart, but the injustice gnawed at him, sparking a sense of defiance he hadn't felt before. The realization that Tyler's cruelty came from a place of weakness, not strength, gave him a sliver of empowerment. A knowledge that perhaps he wasn't as helpless as Tyler wanted him to believe. The following days were a quiet struggle, each one a test of his resilience. Elijah began to meet Tyler's gaze, not with fear, but with a calm determination that unnerved his tormentor. He walked through the hallways with Amelia by his side, their bond a quiet act of defiance against Tyler's cruelty. Together, they forged a small but powerful alliance, one that reminded Elijah he wasn't alone. But the shadows of doubt still lingered, and as the school prepared for a major event, a talent showcase where students were encouraged to express their unique abilities, Elijah found himself facing a choice. He could step forward, share a part of himself he'd hidden away, or remain in the background, unseen and unheard. In a moment of courage, Elijah decided he would perform, using sign language and music to tell a story without words. The idea terrified him. The thought of standing in front of his classmates a daunting challenge. But he knew he had to do it, not for the applause, not for the recognition, but to reclaim his voice in a world that had tried so hard to silence him. As the showcase approached, Elijah practiced in secret, his hands moving gracefully as he crafted a story of resilience and hope. The performance was his way of fighting back, of proving to himself and to Tyler that he was more than their taunts, more than their dismissive looks. It was his way of saying, "I am here and I will not be silenced." Have you ever felt invisible? If you're cheering for Elijah to find his strength, let us know in the comments. And if you want to see more inspiring journeys like his, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The day of the talent showcase arrived with an unusual tension in the air. As Elijah walked through the halls that morning, he felt every eye on him. Whispers seemed to follow him, carried by currents of curiosity and skepticism. Rumors had spread that he would be performing, and the idea of him, the quietest kid in the school, taking center stage, was enough to pique everyone's interest. Amelia found him near his locker, her presence a calming influence on his frayed nerves. She gave him a reassuring smile, her hands moving in a gentle sign. "You're going to be amazing." Elijah returned the smile, though his heart was racing. The thought of performing in front of everyone, especially Tyler and his friends, made his stomach twist with anxiety. But he clung to Amelia's support and the quiet encouragement he felt from his mother's words echoing in his mind. He was doing this for himself, to break free from the shadows Tyler had cast over him, to prove that he was more than the silence others assumed defined him. As the showcase began, the auditorium filled with students, parents, and teachers. The lights dimmed, casting a spotlight on the stage. Elijah watched from behind the curtain as each act took their turn. Some sang, others danced, and a few performed comedy skits. The audience cheered for each performance, their energy building with each act. But Elijah remained in a world of his own, focusing on the rhythm of his heartbeat, grounding himself. Finally, his name was called. The room fell silent as he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights casting shadows across his face. He scanned the crowd, catching sight of Tyler's sneering expression and the curious, skeptical glances from other students. His hands trembled, but he took a deep breath, closing his eyes briefly to center himself. He reminded himself why he was here. Not for their approval, but to reclaim a part of himself he'd kept hidden for too long. As the music began, Elijah lifted his hands and started to sign, his movements slow and deliberate, each gesture carrying the weight of his experiences, his pain, and his resilience. He had chosen a piece that combined soft instrumental music with American Sign Language, crafting a story that words couldn't fully convey, a story of silence, isolation, and the unyielding strength that lay within him. The audience watched in stunned silence, the beauty and intensity of his performance captivating them. Each movement of his hands seemed to tell a story of struggle and hope, a testament to the quiet battle he had fought each day. Even those who hadn't understood him before began to feel the emotions radiating from him, connecting with his pain in a way they hadn't anticipated. Amelia watched from the front row, her eyes shining with pride. She had helped him practice, encouraged him when he doubted himself, and seeing him on that stage, unafraid, filled her with a sense of awe. To her, Elijah wasn't just performing. He was telling his truth, sharing a piece of himself with a world that had tried so hard to ignore him. As his performance neared its end, Elijah opened his eyes, locking them onto Tyler's gaze. For the first time, he didn't see Tyler as an enemy, but as someone who could no longer define his worth. The anger and fear that Tyler had instilled in him began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace and self-assurance. Elijah was free, not from the bullying or the judgment, but from the hold they had over his self-image. The final note of the music played, and Elijah lowered his hands, the silence in the auditorium stretching on for a moment that felt endless. Then the audience erupted into applause, the sound filling the space in a way that Elijah could only feel through the vibrations in the floor. He felt their support, their acceptance, in a way he'd never experienced before. As he stepped off the stage, Amelia met him with a tight hug, her pride evident in the way she held him. "You did it," she signed, her smile wide. Elijah's heart swelled with gratitude and relief, the warmth of the moment wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. But as the applause faded, Elijah noticed Tyler standing near the back of the auditorium, his face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and something Elijah couldn't quite identify. There was no applause from him, no sneer, only a quiet, unreadable expression that made Elijah pause. For a fleeting moment, Tyler's mask had slipped, revealing vulnerability, perhaps even envy, hidden beneath his hardened exterior. Later that day, as Elijah was preparing to leave, he found Tyler waiting for him near the exit. Elijah's first instinct was to turn away, but something kept him rooted in place, a quiet defiance simmering beneath his calm expression. Tyler approached him, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. After a long pause, he muttered, barely meeting Elijah's eyes, "You're good at that." The words were clumsy, unpolished, but they carried a weight that Elijah recognized. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a small gesture of respect that hinted at something deeper. Elijah met Tyler's gaze, giving him a nod, a silent truce that needed no words. As he walked away, Elijah felt a sense of closure, a quiet victory that went beyond the applause or the performance. He had faced his fears, stood up to the silence that had defined him, and emerged stronger, unbroken. He knew the journey wasn't over, that there would still be challenges, but he felt ready to face them, knowing he had the strength to overcome. That night, as he recounted the day to his mother, signing each word with pride, Grace held him close, tears of joy shimmering in her eyes. She had always believed in him, and now he believed in himself. For the first time, Elijah Harper felt truly seen. The days following the showcase left Elijah in a haze of wonder and disbelief. For so long, he'd imagined what it would be like to be seen, to stand among his peers without feeling invisible. And now, with every step he took through the hallways of St. Mary's, he could feel it. An intangible shift in the air, like a new chapter had begun, one he had dared not hope for. Walking through the school, Elijah noticed subtle changes in the faces around him. The sneers and dismissive glances had softened into curious stares, even a few respectful nods. Some students would smile as they passed, shy but genuine. A group of younger children even waved, their admiration shining through their wide eyes. It felt surreal, almost like he had stepped into someone else's life, a life where he was accepted, even celebrated. Amelia was there beside him, as always, her quiet presence a reminder that he was no longer alone. But now, instead of sitting together in the secluded corners of the playground, they often found themselves in the open, where others joined, listening as Elijah signed stories and shared pieces of himself he had kept locked away. The shadows that had once haunted him, the voices that had mocked his silence, began to fade, replaced by a newfound lightness, a feeling of belonging. One afternoon, Amelia turned to him, her face bright with excitement. She signed with her hands moving quickly, filled with enthusiasm. "Elijah, you're inspiring them. They see you now, really see you." Elijah felt a surge of warmth in his chest, a sense of fulfillment that was both overwhelming and empowering. Her words resonated within him, touching a part of him that had long been buried under years of silence and fear. He smiled, nodding as he thought about the stories he had shared with his classmates, each gesture a piece of his heart, a part of his journey. Encouraged by Amelia's words, Elijah started to stay after school, practicing his storytelling through sign language in the quiet of the empty halls. It was in these moments, alone with his thoughts, that he felt most alive. His hands moved with grace and purpose, each motion expressing emotions he couldn't speak but could feel, with every fibre of his being. The stories he shared were no longer just his. They had become bridges, connections to others, a testament to the strength he had found in his silence. One evening, as he stood by the window in the school's empty library, lost in thought, he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he saw Tyler, standing a few feet away, his face unreadable, eyes flickering with something unfamiliar. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing with memories of the cruelty, the taunts, the moments Tyler had torn down his spirit. He braced himself, expecting another harsh remark, another attempt to belittle him. But Tyler's expression softened, a hint of discomfort shadowing his gaze. He seemed to hesitate, as if battling words he didn't know how to say. Finally he mumbled, his voice low and unsteady, "That thing you did at the showcase, it was powerful." Elijah's breath caught. The words weren't an apology, but they felt like something more, a rare, raw moment of vulnerability from the boy who had once relished in his suffering. For the first time, Tyler wasn't looking at him with disdain or pity. His gaze held a mix of confusion and begrudging respect, emotions Elijah had never expected to see in him. In that brief exchange, Elijah realized that he wasn't the only one who had changed. His courage had forced a shift, not just within himself, but in those around him. Tyler's silence spoke volumes, and in that quiet moment, Elijah found a fragile truce, a silent acknowledgement that they were both more than the roles they had played in each other's lives. That evening, Elijah walked home with a lightness in his heart. The weight he had carried, the fear, the resentment, it all began to dissolve, replaced by something gentler, something healing. He felt ready to share this transformation with the one person who had always believed in him, who had carried him through the darkest days with her love and strength. When he arrived home, his mother was waiting in the kitchen, her face soft with concern and curiosity. Elijah could barely contain his excitement, signing rapidly as he recounted every detail. The applause, the smiles, the children who waved, Tyler's unexpected words. Grace watched him, her eyes filling with tears, her hands reaching out to hold his. "You did it, Elijah," she signed, her movements slow and deliberate, each gesture carrying the pride and love she felt. "You found your voice." Elijah felt a swell of emotion, his own tears forming as he realized the truth of her words. For so long, he had believed his silence made him weak, that his inability to speak made him less. But now, he understood that his silence held a strength, a depth that words could never capture. It was a strength born from pain, from resilience, from a journey that had forced him to confront himself in ways most people never had to. In that moment, as Grace held him close, Elijah felt the walls around his heart finally fall. The boy who had once felt invisible, who had cowered in the shadows, had emerged into the light. And with his mother's arms around him, he knew he was finally whole, that he had found a place within himself where he could stand strong, unafraid of who he was. As he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, Elijah's thoughts drifted to the future. The stories he had practiced, the moments he had shared, they were just the beginning. He could feel the promise of new chapters, of paths he hadn't yet explored. And as he closed his eyes, he knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, he had discovered a strength within him that no one could take away. Elijah Harper had found his voice, not in words, but in the quiet power of his silence. Months passed, and the crisp chill of winter had melted into the gentle warmth of spring. The hallways of St. Mary's felt different to Elijah now, not because they had changed, but because he had. As he walked through the familiar corridors, he felt lighter, freer, as though the weight he had carried for so long had been replaced by an unwavering sense of purpose. Each day brought new surprises. Students who once barely noticed him would stop to chat, some even asking him to show them a few signs, eager to bridge the gap they had once ignored. His stories, told with expressive hands and vivid expressions, had become a beloved part of the school. Younger children gathered around him during recess, wide-eyed and attentive, captivated by the tales he spun with the silent power of his hands. Even Tyler had changed in his own quiet way. Though they weren't friends, the hostility had faded, replaced by a mutual respect that needed no words. They would exchange nods in the hallway, a simple gesture that acknowledged the journey they had both endured. Elijah had forgiven him, not for Tyler's sake, but for his own, to release the resentment and find peace within himself. One afternoon, as he was sharing a story with a group of first graders, Miss Archer, his former teacher, approached him with an uncertain smile. She watched as Elijah animatedly signed, his face alive with emotion, his hands moving gracefully as he narrated. When he finished, Miss Archer clapped, her applause soft but genuine. "Elijah," she said, her voice filled with something Elijah had never heard from her before: admiration. "I had no idea you had such a gift." Elijah met her gaze, nodding with a small smile. The forgiveness he extended to her was quiet, a gentle release of the memories of isolation he had once endured in her class. He understood now that his journey wasn't about changing others, but about finding strength within himself, regardless of who noticed. The impact of his transformation extended beyond the school. At home, he grew closer to his mother, Grace, who became his biggest supporter, encouraging him to pursue storytelling as a passion. She watched proudly as he crafted each narrative, her heart swelling with joy every time she saw him share his world with others. Elijah's stories became a way for them to connect on a deeper level, each performance a tribute to the strength she had always believed in. But one day, as spring warmed the air, Elijah received a surprising invitation. The school was holding a special assembly to celebrate students who had shown resilience, courage, and leadership, and they had chosen him as a speaker. The invitation filled him with a mixture of excitement and nerves, but he knew this was his chance to tell his story, to share not just with his classmates, but with the teachers, the staff, and everyone who had been part of his journey. On the day of the assembly, the auditorium filled with students, teachers, and parents. Elijah stood backstage, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to walk out. Amelia was beside him, giving him a reassuring nod, her presence a reminder of the friendship that had sustained him through his darkest days. When he stepped onto the stage, the applause was warm, a wave of support that enveloped him. He took a deep breath, letting the energy of the crowd settle within him. As he began to sign his story, starting from his earliest memories of isolation, the bullying, the moment he found his strength, and finally, his journey to self-acceptance, the room fell into a deep silence. He spoke of resilience, of finding power in silence, of the quiet strength that had carried him through each painful moment. And as he finished, he looked out into the audience, his gaze meeting his mother's. Her face was radiant with pride, her eyes filled with tears. In that moment, Elijah felt a connection that words could never express, a bond that went beyond language, beyond sound, an understanding that filled every corner of his heart. The audience rose to their feet, the applause resonating through the room, a chorus of support that brought tears to Elijah's eyes. He knew then that he was no longer defined by silence or isolation. He was no longer the boy who hid in shadows, afraid to be seen. He was Elijah Harper, a storyteller, a friend, and above all, a survivor. As he left the stage, his heart brimming with gratitude, he understood that his journey was far from over. There would be more stories to tell, more challenges to face, but now he faced them with the unshakable knowledge that his voice, though silent, was powerful, and for the first time, he felt a profound peace, a certainty that he had found his place in a world that had once seemed so distant. Elijah Harper had transformed his silence into strength, and with it, he was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Elijah's journey shows us that resilience can turn silence into strength. If his story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of courage and hope. Share in the comments what gives you strength, and let's inspire each other to embrace our unique voices.